The bread came out wrong the first time. I know that now. Looking back across 20 years of mornings spent with my hands in flour, I can see exactly where I made the mistake. The water was too warm, the kitchen too cold, and I had no idea what I was doing. But on that October morning in 1934, standing alone in my great-grandmother's kitchen with a loaf that looked more like a river stone than food, I thought I had failed at the only thing left to try. That was the third week of October. The wheat was already in, what there was of it. 41 bushels off 160 acres, which is not farming so much as it is losing slowly. The elm trees along County Road 7 had gone yellow and were dropping fast, and the sky over Cass County had that particular gray to it that North Dakota gets in autumn. Not quite cloud, not quite light, just a flat ceiling pressing everything closer to the ground. I was 18 years old. I had been running the farm alone for 7 weeks. My grandfather, Elias, had died on the last day of August, a stroke, in the South Field, on a Thursday afternoon. The doctor said he likely never felt the ground come up to meet him. I had found him myself, just before supper, lying face down between 2 rows of stunted wheat. His hat was still on his head. I didn't have anyone to call. There was a second cousin in Bismarck who sent a card. There was the Lutheran pastor from Wheatfield who came out and said words over the grave we dug on the low hill behind the barn. There were 3 neighbors who brought food and stayed long enough to look around the property with the particular expression men use when they are calculating value and don't want you to see it. And there was a banker from Fargo, a man named Caldwell, who drove out 2 weeks after the funeral in a clean black Ford and sat across from me at the kitchen table and explained, in the patient tone of someone speaking to a child, that the note was $312 and that it came due December 15th, and that he personally could not see, and here he paused and looked at me the way a man looks at a fence post, how a boy my age was going to meet it. He used the word twice in that conversation. He shook my hand at the door and said he hoped things would work out. I watched his Ford until it disappeared past the elm row, and then I stood in the yard for a long time, with my grandfather's barn coat on, and the wind coming down from the north, and nothing in any direction but flat land and sky. I went back inside. I needed to find a way to keep this farm. What I didn't know yet was that my great-grandmother had already found it for me, 37 years before I was born. The first thing I did was walk the farm. Not to inspect it, I'd walked every foot of it since I was 7. I walked it because I didn't know what else to do, and movement was easier than sitting at that table with the note lying on it like something dead. I started at the barn and went clockwise. The red hip-roof barn with its south-facing lean-to, the smokehouse with the rusted hasp, the hand pump that needed priming every morning in cold weather, the root cellar with its slanted cellar doors going gray at the grain. I walked the fence line along the north field, where the wheat had come in thin and pale that year, 40 bushels off 160 acres, when a good year would have given me 1,200. The drought had taken the rest. The soil cracked in long seams like it was tired of being asked. I walked out to where Cobb was standing in the east paddock, that big roan Belgian with his head down and his ears doing nothing in particular. He was 16 hands, calm as furniture, old enough that Elias had stopped working him hard. I put my hand on his neck, and he didn't move. I stayed there a while. The whole property felt smaller now that it was mine, or maybe it felt larger. I couldn't tell which. That evening, I went through Elias's papers at the kitchen desk, the same roll top he'd used for 50 years, the pigeonholes stuffed with receipts from Reinhardt's Feed and Grain, tax notices, a 1931 letter from the county extension office about winter rye. I was looking for anything I might sell without ruining what I was trying to save. There wasn't much. The 1928 John Deere Model D was worth something, but without it, I couldn't work the land even if the land was worth working. Cobb was worth something, but he was also the only thing on the property that seemed glad I was there. I found an envelope in the back of the bottom drawer with my name on it. Not my full name, just the boy in Elias's handwriting. Inside was a single index card. It said, "Root cellar, bottom shelf, left corner. Your great-grandmother left something there. I never touched it. It wasn't mine to touch." That was all. I read it twice. I read it a third time. Elias had known something was there and had left it for 37 years without opening it. I didn't know whether that was discipline or superstition or something closer to faith. Maybe all three. He'd been a quiet man who believed that things arrived when they were meant to, a belief I'd considered foolish until about 5 minutes after I read that card. I put on my coat. I took the kerosene lamp off its hook by the door. The night was cold and the stars were hard, and I walked across the yard toward the root cellar. The cellar door was set into a low earthen mound at the north end of the barn, 2 planks of cottonwood on iron hinges that had rusted to the color of old blood. I'd been down there twice since arriving, once to take inventory, once to check that the potato bins weren't rotting. Both times in daylight, both times in a hurry. I hadn't gone to the left corner either time. I hadn't known there was anything to go to. I lifted the door, and the cold came up first. That specific underground cold that carries no wind and no smell except earth and time. I went down the 7 steps sideways, the lamp held out ahead of me, and let my eyes adjust. The root cellar was 12 feet by 14. Shelves on 3 walls. Rough-cut pine on iron brackets driven into the packed dirt. The right wall held the potato bins and 3 rows of mason jars, preserves from a year or 2 back, some of them cloudy, some of them still good-looking in the amber lamplight. The back wall had empty shelves, except for a coil of rope and a rusted hand plane someone had stored and forgotten. The left wall was lower. The ceiling sloped there where the mound peaked, and whoever had built the shelves had built them in 3 tiers rather than 4, each one only 10 inches deep. The bottom shelf was 6 inches off the dirt floor. I had to kneel. I moved the lamp close. At the far left corner, pushed back against the wall so that the shelf above it nearly brushed the top, was a tin tobacco box. 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, maybe 3 deep. The lid had been pressed on tight and sealed around the edge with what looked like candle wax, yellowed to the color of old teeth. There was no label, no writing on the outside, just the box. I did not open it immediately. I knelt there on the dirt floor of that root cellar in Cass County, North Dakota, on a Tuesday night in late September 1934, holding a kerosene lamp, and I looked at what my great-grandmother had hidden there 37 years before I was born. She had pressed that lid down sometime in 1897, sealed it, slid it into the corner, and covered it with the ordinary darkness of a working cellar. She had trusted the cold and the earth to keep whatever was inside. He had found it at some point, found it, read the note my great-grandmother left, and put it back. Had lived on this land for decades with the knowledge that something waited in the corner, and had decided it wasn't his. Now it was mine. I lifted it with both hands. It was lighter than I expected, and dry. The wax seal had held. I carried it up the steps and back across the yard toward the house, the lamp swinging from my other hand, and I did not open it outside. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. The table was old pine, scarred from decades of use. Elias's coffee rings, my great-grandmother's knife work, the impression of 10,000 meals pressed into the grain. I set the tin box at the center of it and sat down across from it the way you'd sit across from someone you weren't sure you trusted yet. The Monarch range was still ticking with residual heat. Outside the window, the yard was dark and the wind had picked up from the northwest, the way it does in late September in Cass County, when the season has finally decided what it is. I could hear the Belgian shifting in his stall. The house smelled like kerosene and old wood, and something underneath both of those things, something that had been in the walls longer than I had been alive. I worked the wax seal loose with my thumbnail. It came away in a single piece, which surprised me. Someone had done this before, had worked it loose and pressed it back neatly, leaving the seam almost invisible. Elias. He had opened this and closed it again and put it back in the ground and never said a word about it to anyone. I turned that over in my mind for a moment before I lifted the lid. Inside was a ledger, 6 inches by 9, give or take. The cover was dark brown leather, water-stained at the lower corner, warped slightly from some long-ago moisture that had since dried and been forgotten. The spine was intact. Whoever had made it to last. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and very regular, the letters sitting upright on lines she had drawn herself in pencil. 2 languages, sometimes within the same sentence, German and English trading off where one ran out of the right word and the other filled it in. The ink had faded to a brownish gray, the color of dried creek water, but it was legible, every word of it. At the top of the first page, in English, she had written a date. October 12, 1897. 37 years ago, 1 month after she and August had filed the claim on this parcel, 160 acres on what would eventually be County Road 7, 4 miles east of a town that barely existed yet. She had been here less than a month when she opened this ledger and started writing. I didn't read the whole thing that night. I read the first 3 pages, then stopped, and sat with my hands flat on the table and the lamp burning between me and the window. What I had read in those 3 pages was a recipe, exact, meticulous, written the way someone writes something they expect to teach to a person they haven't met yet. I turned back to the beginning and read it again more carefully. The recipe began with flour and water. That much I already knew. But the proportions she had written were not guesses. They were precise in the way that only someone who had failed and recovered and failed again could make them precise. 40 grams of rye flour to 50 grams of water, adjusted by season. In summer, she noted, use less water by a count of 5. In winter, warm the water to the temperature of fresh milk. She had written this in English, then crossed it out and rewritten it in German, then written it in English again beneath that, as if she didn't trust either language to carry the meaning alone. I read it twice before I understood what it was describing. She wasn't writing about making bread from nothing. She was writing about keeping something alive. The starter, she called it Der Ansatz. Then crossed that out and wrote the mother, required feeding every 48 hours in warm weather, every 72 in cold, equal parts flour and water, the same rye she noted she bought from a German miller 2 counties west. She described the smell it should have, sour but not sharp, she wrote. Like creek water after rain. She described the surface, bubbled, risen, smelling of wheat and thyme. She described what it looked like when it was wrong, when it had gone gray at the edges or developed a thin, watery layer on top. Do not throw it out, she had written in the margin, underlined twice. Pour the water off and feed it again. It wants to live. Let it. I sat at that table for a long time. The lamp oil was burning low. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving along the north side of the house the way it does in late October, looking for a place to get in. I could hear the draft horse shifting his weight in the barn. There was something in the way she wrote that I could not quite account for. She was not writing for herself. She was not keeping a private record of her own practice. She wrote the way a teacher writes, in the imperative, with the assumption that a reader exists who does not yet know what she knows. She wrote as if the information were urgent, as if she were pressing it into someone's hands and asking them to hold it carefully. I turned to the second page. At the top, she had recorded a date, March 4th, 1909. And below it, a brief entry, shorter than the rest, written quickly, the letters slightly less careful than on the pages before. I read it once and did not quite understand it. I read it again. Then I stood up from the table, took the lamp, and walked to the cellar door. The cellar door was set into the kitchen floor, beside the range. 2 iron rings, a wooden frame, planks fitted tight enough that in summer you could walk across them without knowing they were there. I lifted the near ring and the door came up heavy, the way it always did, swollen at the hinges from years of damp. The smell came up first, cold earth, the faint sweetness of stored apples, something mineral and old that I had never been able to name. I went down the 7 steps holding the lamp out in front of me. The cellar ran the length of the kitchen, maybe 14 feet, with shelves on 3 sides built from rough-cut pine. Elias's work, I had always assumed, though now I was less certain. The lowest shelf on the north wall was nearly at floor level, the boards dark with age and moisture. Crocks of lard, a broken hoe handle, 2 mason jars of something that had gone bad years ago, the lids domed upward with pressure. I had been down here a dozen times since September. I had never paid that shelf particular attention. The entry had said, "Beneath the lowest shelf, north wall, wrapped in oilcloth." I set the lamp on the second shelf and got down on my knees. The floor of the cellar was packed earth, cold enough that I could feel it through my trousers. I reached under the shelf. My hand found the wall, then moved along it, and then, maybe 8 inches from the left end, my fingers touched something that was not dirt and was not wood. I pulled it out carefully. It was a tin tobacco box, the kind with a hinged lid and a paper label, long since turned to nothing. It was sealed around the seam with what looked like candle wax, applied in 2 careful passes. The box was about the size of a man's hand. It was heavier than I expected. I did not open it immediately. I sat back on my heels and held it in both hands and looked at it in the lamplight for a moment. The wax seal was intact. 37 years intact, if the date in the ledger was accurate, and I had no reason to believe it wasn't. I carried the box and the lamp back up the 7 steps, set them both on the table, and sat down. The ledger was open beside me. The March 4th entry read, in her careful hand, "The crock is sealed and set. The culture is strong. I have written what it needs. Whoever finds this will know what to do." I looked at the box. I looked at the ledger. Outside, the wind found its place along the eave and held there, steady and low. I worked the wax away from the seam with my thumbnail and opened the lid. Inside the tin box, wrapped in a single layer of waxed cloth, was a leather ledger, smaller than Marta's main one, no larger than my palm. And beneath it, folded twice into a tight square, a sheet of paper covered in the same careful hand. I set the ledger aside for a moment and unfolded the paper. It was a set of instructions, not a letter, not an explanation, instructions, written in the practical shorthand of a woman who did not waste words or flour. The German was minimal, most of it was English, and plain English at that. Take the crock from the lower shelf, north wall. It is a 2-gallon stoneware, Albany slip, sealed with cork and lard. If the cellar has stayed cold, it will be alive. Feed it equal weight flour and water, 65 degrees if you can manage it. Wait 12 hours. If it rises and smells sharp and faintly sweet, it is ready. If it smells wrong, it is gone. If it is gone, use the dry recipe in the small ledger instead. But the living culture is better. It has always been better. I read it twice. Then I went back down the cellar steps. The crock was where she said it would be, north wall, lower shelf. I had walked past it an hour ago without stopping, because it looked like every other crock on that shelf, heavy and unremarkable, the kind of vessel you assume holds old lard or nothing at all. It was sealed with a cork, and what I now recognized as a thick collar of hardened lard, poured and set in a ring around the cork's base, pale yellow and perfectly intact. I lifted it. It was heavy. I carried it up carefully, the way you carry something you are not sure you have the right to carry. I set it on the table next to the lamp and the open ledger and the small palm-sized notebook and the folded instruction sheet, and I stood there, looking at all of it arranged in the lamplight. It was close to midnight. The wind was still in the eave. The range had burned down to coals and the kitchen had gone cool. I did not open the crock that night, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, though I was, a little, but because the instruction sheet said 65 degrees if you can manage it. And the kitchen was cold and getting colder, and if the culture inside was alive after 37 years, it deserved better than a drafty kitchen at midnight in late October. It deserved the right conditions. Marta had taken that kind of care. I could too. I banked the range instead, added 2 splits of cottonwood, and closed the damper down to a slow burn. I left the crock on the table, where it would catch the warmth as the kitchen came back up. Then I sat down and opened the small ledger. The small ledger was not the recipe book. I had been confusing them in my mind, calling them both ledgers, treating them as one thing, but they were not. The water-stained leather book held the instructions, the starter method, the feeding schedule, the flour-to-water ratios written out in Marta's careful hand. This smaller one, palm-sized, its cover worn almost smooth, was something else. It was a record of transactions, dates down the left column, names across the middle, numbers on the right. August 14th, 1897. Hofer, 2 loaves, was 6 sacks. I stopped. August 14th, 1897 was 37 years ago, almost to the month. The Hofer name was still on the dry goods storefront in Wheatfield. I had passed it a dozen times without thinking about it. I kept reading. The entries ran from summer 1897 through the winter of 1911, 14 years. 160-some names, farm families, the Lutheran church, the grain elevator foreman, a name I recognized as the original owner of the land Dale Pritchard now farmed. Marta had sold to all of them, 8 cents here, 6 cents there, occasionally a trade, a loaf for a pound of lard, 2 loaves for a half bushel of oats. The numbers were small, but the record was meticulous. Every transaction in the same even hand. She missed almost nothing. I ran the columns on a piece of scrap paper. In 1903 alone, she had sold or traded 212 loaves. At even 6 cents average, that was $12.72 from bread alone. In a year when wheat prices had been poor, when Elias, my grandfather, then a boy of maybe 12, would have been going to the county schoolhouse and coming home to a farm that barely broke even on grain, Marta had been running a bread trade out of this kitchen that added more to the household than the wheat crop some seasons. Nobody had told me that. Nobody had told me because nobody knew. I turned the pages carefully. Near the back, the entries changed character, less frequent. The last dozen pages had gaps of weeks, sometimes a month, between entries. Her handwriting grew smaller, more compressed, as if she was trying to use the space carefully. Then, in March of 1909, a different kind of entry. Not a transaction, but a note, a paragraph running the full width of the page in both German and English, the 2 languages switching mid-sentence, the way people do when they are writing quickly, and the thought is bigger than one language can hold. I could not read the German portions, but the English was there, and it was enough. The culture is strong still, fed it this morning, sealed it in the 2-gallon crock, with the cork and the collar of lard. Cold cellar will keep it, someone will find it when they need it. I set the ledger down flat on the table. The range ticked softly behind me. I sat at that table for a long time. The range ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwood at the corner of the house, and the branch scraped the east wall the way it always did in October, the same sound it had made every night since I was small enough to sleep here on visits. I had always thought it was something trying to get in. Now it sounded like something that had already been inside a long time, waiting. Someone will find it when they need it. She had written that in March of 1909, 25 years ago. She had sealed the crock and walked back up the cellar steps, and presumably baked her bread that week and the next week, and however many weeks she had left before her hands could not manage it, or her eyes could not read her own ledger entries. And then nobody had gone looking. Not Elias, not anyone between Elias and me. I picked the ledger up again and went back to the 1909 entry. Read the English portions a second time, then a third. The crock she described, 2 gallons, Albany slip, cork and lard collar. I had seen it. I had moved it myself. It was sitting on the second shelf from the left in the root cellar, behind 3 empty quart jars and a flat of dried seed corn that had gone hard as gravel. I had set my lantern on top of it without giving it a second look. It had the dull brown glaze of every other piece of old stoneware in this county. There was nothing written on it. I had taken it for empty. I got up from the table, I put on my barn coat and took the lantern off its hook by the back door and went out into the dark. The cellar steps were cold under my boots. The temperature dropped 4 degrees from the top step to the bottom. I had noticed that in the first week and stopped noticing it after that. Now I noticed it again. 52 degrees, maybe 53, given the season. Marta had not been guessing. She had known exactly what this cellar held and what it could keep alive. I set the lantern on the bottom step and moved the seed flat aside, moved the quart jars, lifted the crock down with both hands. It was heavier than I remembered. The lard collar had hardened to the consistency of old soap, gray-white, firm, completely unbroken. The cork beneath it was still seated. I did not open it. Not yet. I carried it upstairs and set it on the kitchen table next to the ledger, and for a moment, the 2 objects sat there together in the lamplight, the record and the thing it described, and I understood that she had intended this, the pairing of them, the way a key is made for one specific lock. I set the ledger open to the March 1909 entry and read it again. The German words I had worked through slowly across several nights, a dictionary borrowed from Agnes sitting at my elbow, pencil notations in the margins of a separate sheet. I had the translation clean now. I have sealed the mother into the gray crock with the chipped lip. Cork and lard. It will keep at cellar temperature. Whoever finds this will know what to do. Whoever finds this. She had not written, my son, or my granddaughter, or even the family. She had written, whoever. 37 years. She must have known it was possible no one would find it for a very long time. I went to the range and fed it 2 lengths of split oak. The Monarch ticked and expanded as the firebox heated. I filled the kettle from the hand pump at the sink, set it on the back burner where the temperature was moderate. The ledger said, begin revival with water no hotter than a comfortable hand can hold. 1 tablespoon starter to 2 tablespoons flour, 2 tablespoons water. Wait 12 hours. Watch for movement. I had read that instruction 6 times. Each time the word and stopped me. 37 years was not a dormancy. It was closer to burial. I did not know if what was inside the crock was still alive, or only a gray paste that had once been alive, a fossil of something that had once made bread rise for an entire county. I took my grandfather's paring knife and worked it slowly around the lard collar. It came away in sections, dense and waxy, landing on the table with a sound like chalk. Beneath it, the cork sat exactly as it had been seated in 1909. I pressed my thumbs against it, and it turned, just slightly, before releasing. A smell came out, sour, sharp, faintly alcoholic, like a root cellar and a brewery compressed into one breath. Not the smell of rot, the smell of fermentation. I held the lantern close. The surface of the starter was the color of old cream, with a faint webbing of liquid at the edges. I touched it with the tip of a clean spoon. It had texture. It had the resistance of something that had not died. I measured by Marta's ratios into a clean bowl. A tablespoon of the starter, gray ivory, cool. 2 tablespoons of flour from the sack. 2 tablespoons of warm water from the kettle. I stirred it until the flour disappeared. I covered the bowl with a cloth and set it on the warming shelf above the firebox, where the temperature held between 65 and 70 degrees. I had checked it with the milk thermometer across 3 nights to be certain. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled the ledger toward me, and began reading from the beginning. The first entry was dated April 3, 1897. The handwriting was small and slanted, the German words cramped together, the English ones larger, as if she had learned them later and given them more room. She described the crossing from Minnesota in a farm wagon, 4 days on frozen mud roads, arriving at a plot of raw prairie that had no building on it yet, just stakes in the ground where August had marked the corners. She wrote about making bread that first week in a Dutch oven set over a fire pit, before the stove had been hauled in. She wrote about the starter she had carried from her mother's kitchen in a sealed jar wrapped in wool, the same culture, she noted, that her mother's mother had brought from Württemberg in 1861. 36 years in one continuous line before it ever touched North Dakota soil. I read slowly. The lantern burned low, and I trimmed it and kept reading. She wrote about failures, a batch that went gray in summer heat, a crock she left uncovered in August and had to discard entirely. She wrote about learning the cellar's cold spots and warm spots the way you learn a person's moods, by paying attention long enough and by being wrong first. She recorded temperatures the way a doctor records a pulse, methodically, without drama. 52 degrees at the far north wall, 58 at the steps. Keep the crock at the north wall. I had found it at the north wall. By midnight, the kitchen had gone cold except near the firebox. I pulled my grandfather's coat across my shoulders and kept reading. Outside, the wind had settled into that low, steady pressure that meant it was not going anywhere before morning. Around the third year of entries, 1900, early spring, she wrote a single line that I read twice, then a third time. The bread is not a product, it is an argument. It says we are staying. I set the ledger down on the table. I looked at the cloth-covered bowl on the warming shelf. Then I looked around the kitchen, at the cracked plaster above the window, at Elias's coat on its hook, at the Monarch range with its warped left burner plate and its steady orange glow through the firebox grate. In the morning, I would check the bowl. If the starter had bubbled overnight, if it had risen even slightly, I would know Marta's culture had survived another feeding. If it hadn't moved, I would try again, adjust the water temperature, try a slightly higher ratio of flour, wait another 12 hours. I would not panic. Patience was the only tool I had that required no money and did not break down in cold weather. I turned the lantern down to its lowest wick and sat another few minutes in the near dark, listening to the range tick and settle. Then I went to bed and let the starter do its work. The starter moved. I found it in the morning before I lit the range, lifted the cloth and saw the surface had domed slightly, cracked at the center in a slow, lazy bubble, and there was the smell of it, that sour, sweet, fermented smell that I had come to recognize the way you recognize the sound of a particular engine turning over. Not spectacular, not dramatic, just alive. I fed it again and waited. By December, the rhythm had settled into something I no longer had to think about. Every 48 hours. Every Saturday morning, 12 loaves in 2 batches on the Monarch's lower shelf, and by 10 o'clock, Agnes had them on the counter at the dry goods store, wrapped in brown paper, 2 cents back on the price if you returned the paper the following week. People came. Not out of charity. I understood the difference. They came because the bread was the bread it had always been. Before the drought, before the depression, before any of us were born. A few of the older women in Wheatfield told Agnes they remembered it. One said she had thought she was misremembering, that nothing could taste exactly the way childhood tasted. Agnes told her she wasn't misremembering. The banknote came due on December 15th. I drove into Fargo on a Thursday with $312 in an envelope, wheat sale, bread sale, and $12 I had held back from the fall by not replacing the magneto until January. The man at First Meridian looked at the envelope for a moment longer than necessary. He extended the note into the following year without being asked. He did not say he was surprised. He also did not say he wasn't. Dale Pritchard stood in line on the last Saturday before Christmas. He waited like everyone else. He did not look at me when he reached the counter. He put down his 8 cents, took his loaf, and walked out. I watched through the window as he set it on the seat of his truck. I had nothing to say to him. The bread said it for me. Marta wrote in her ledger, in the very last entry, dated February 1911, "Feed the starter even when you are tired. Feed it especially then." I did not understand that line the first time I read it. I understand it now. She was not talking about the starter. I am still on the farm. The cracked plaster above the kitchen window is still there. The coat is still on its hook. The crock is still in the root cellar, sealed, waiting, in case I ever need to begin again. If you found something like this, in a barn, in a cellar, in a drawer your grandfather kept locked, tell me in the comments. I want to hear it. And if you know someone who's been told they're too young for the work in front of them, send them this.